The ballroom of Pembroke House glowed with the warm light of 1,000 candles on the evening of October 15th, 1817, casting dancing shadows across the faces of London's finest society as they swirled and laughed beneath chandeliers dripping with crystal. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the edge of the gathering as she always did, a figure in dove-grey silk that marked her as something between mourning and invisibility, neither young enough to be pitied as a hopeful debutante, nor old enough to be respected as a dignified widow, but rather existing in that peculiar limbo reserved for women of 28 years who had committed the unforgivable sin of scandal. She held a slim volume of poetry close to her side, half hidden in the folds of her gown, a small rebellion that no one noticed because no one looked at her anymore. Not really. Not since the disaster 7 years ago, when her engagement to Lord Edmund Fairfax had shattered spectacularly upon his discovery that she, Eleanor Ashworth, unremarkable and plain, had been writing scandalous poetry under a pseudonym that had set certain corners of society aflame with whispered fascination. The whispers had turned to condemnation the moment her identity became known, and Edmund had withdrawn his suit with such haste that the gossips barely had time to sharpen their tongues before he was gone, leaving her to face the aftermath alone. Now she attended events like this only because her brother Thomas insisted, because Martha Wentworth, her loyal companion, believed fresh air and society were good for the soul, because the alternative was to disappear entirely. And some stubborn part of Eleanor refused to grant society that final victory. She watched the young women in their pale muslins and silk flowers, Caroline Sinclair among them, golden and laughing in a cluster near the refreshment table where Lady Pembroke held court like a plump, bejewelled spider at the centre of her web of gossip and judgment. Caroline had once been her friend, before the scandal, before ambition and social preservation had transformed affection into calculated cruelty, and Eleanor had learned not to flinch when Caroline's eyes slid past her as though she were merely part of the wallpaper, a faded pattern no longer worth acknowledging. The autumn flowers arranged throughout the ballroom released their fading perfume into air, thick with the scent of beeswax and expensive perfumes, and Eleanor found herself cataloguing details as she always did, storing observations like a miser hoarding coins, because if she could not dance, could not laugh freely, could not hope for anything beyond this quiet half-existence, she could at least bear witness to life even from its margins. Then the quality of sound in the room changed, a ripple of awareness moving through the crowd like wind across water, and Eleanor looked up from her careful invisibility to see the crowd parting near the entrance, whispers rising like startled birds, and she knew before she saw him that someone important had arrived, someone dangerous, someone who made even Lady Pembroke's smile freeze into something hard and calculating, as every eye turned toward the tall figure dressed in severe black evening clothes who stood surveying the ballroom with an expression of cool assessment that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine she could not name. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Alexander Ravenscroft, Duke of Thornbridge, stood in the doorway of Pembroke House with the stillness of a predator surveying terrain, his dark eyes moving across the assembled company, with an assessment that felt almost physical in its intensity. And Eleanor found herself unable to look away even as her instinct screamed at her to return to invisibility, to fade back into the safety of being overlooked. He was 35 years old, according to the whispers that had preceded him. Unmarried, despite the parade of ambitious mothers who had thrown their daughters in his path for over a decade, and possessed of a reputation for ruthlessness in business and politics that made even powerful men step carefully around him, a danger that clung to him like the scent of smoke, and made the peacock brightness of the other gentlemen in the room seem suddenly insubstantial as candle flames beside a forge fire. Lady Pembroke moved toward him with the determination of a general marshalling forces, her smile wide and calculated, her hands already gesturing toward the cluster of young women near the refreshment table, where Caroline Sinclair had straightened like a flower, turning toward sudden sun. But the Duke's attention did not follow where Lady Pembroke attempted to direct it, and Eleanor felt the precise moment his gaze found her, across the expanse of polished floor and swirling dancers, a shock of connection that made her breath catch in her throat. She told herself she was imagining it, that men like Alexander Ravenscroft did not look at women like Eleanor Ashworth, that her 7 years of had taught her better than to mistake a passing glance for interest. Yet he continued to study her with a focus that made her acutely aware of the poetry book pressed against her side, the unfashionable cut of her dove-grey gown, the way she stood apart from the others not by choice, but by necessity. His face was all hard planes and sharp angles, handsome in the way of expensive weapons, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure, and when Lady Pembroke finally succeeded in capturing his attention with some comment Eleanor could not hear, he responded with such cool courtesy that it was clearly a dismissal, his eyes returning to Eleanor with an intentness that sent heat climbing up her neck. She watched as he moved through the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never doubted his welcome anywhere, society parting before him, not with the eager warmth they showed to charming rogues, but with the wary respect accorded to something powerful and unpredictable, and Eleanor realized with a flutter of panic that he was moving in her direction, that the casual path he traced between conversational clusters was bringing him steadily closer to her shadowed corner. Outside, the first drops of rain began to patter against the tall windows, a soft percussion beneath the music and laughter, and Eleanor gripped her poetry book tighter as Alexander Ravenscroft's dark gaze held hers across the diminishing distance, something in his expression that looked almost like recognition, as though he saw not the scandalous spinster society had deemed her, but something else entirely, something that made her heart begin to race with a hope she knew was dangerous but could not quite suppress. Eleanor's hands tightened on her poetry book as Alexander Ravenscroft drew near, each step deliberate and unhurried, and she became acutely conscious of the whispers rising around her like a tide, shock rippling through the assembled company, because the Duke of Thornbridge was approaching the ruined spinster in grey, the woman no one acknowledged, the cautionary tale mothers used to warn ambitious daughters about the consequences of impropriety. Her instinct screamed at her to flee, to spare herself whatever humiliation this must certainly be, because men of his station did not seek out women of her disgrace except to mock or to proposition, and she felt heat flood her face at the thought, her fingers going numb around the slim volume she clutched like a talisman against disaster. He stopped before her with a grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size and reputation, and up close he was even more devastating. All dark eyes and sharp intelligence. His evening clothes cut with such precision they might have been armor. And when he inclined his head in greeting, the gesture held none of the dismissive politeness she had grown accustomed to, but rather something that looked almost like respect. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was deeper than she had imagined, cultured and smooth as aged whiskey. "I hope you will forgive my boldness in approaching without proper introduction, but I found myself quite unable to resist making the acquaintance of the only woman in this ballroom who appears to value literature over gossip." Eleanor stared at him, her mind gone blank with shock, because this could not be happening. Dukes did not compliment disgraced spinsters on their reading habits, and she searched his face for signs of mockery but found only genuine interest, his dark eyes steady on hers in a way that made her feel seen for the first time in 7 years. She began, then stopped, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper, and she cleared her throat and tried again. "I fear you have mistaken me for someone of consequence, Your Grace. I am no one of importance." His expression shifted into something that might have been amusement, except his eyes remained serious, intense in their focus. "On the contrary," he replied, "I find that those who society deems unimportant are often the most interesting, and I confess myself curious about what poetry has captured your attention so completely that you have hidden yourself away with it rather than joining the preening display occurring at the center of this gathering." Around them, the whispers had grown to a dull roar, and Eleanor caught sight of Caroline Sinclair's face, frozen in an expression of disbelief and fury, while Lady Pembroke's smile had transformed into something rigid and false, and she knew with sickening certainty that whatever happened next, this moment would be discussed in drawing-rooms across London for weeks to come. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and ominous, and the rain against the windows intensified as Alexander Ravenscroft's gaze dropped to the book in her hands, one dark eyebrow rising in inquiry, and Eleanor found herself incapable of speech, caught between terror and a hope so fragile she dared not even name it as the most dangerous man in London stood before her and waited for her answer, as though her words actually mattered to him. The music began with a sweep of strings that seemed to echo the rising storm outside, and Eleanor felt her breath stop entirely when Alexander Ravenscroft extended his hand to her with a formality that somehow made the gesture more devastating, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that spoke of deliberate choice rather than polite obligation, and she knew with absolute certainty that accepting this waltz would change everything, that dancing with the Duke of Thornbridge would mark her as either his amusement or his interest, and either way society would never let her forget it. Her hand trembled visibly as she placed it in his, her grey glove stark against his black evening clothes, and she felt the strength of his fingers close around hers with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his dangerous reputation, his other hand coming to rest at her waist with a propriety that nonetheless sent heat flooding through her entire body as he drew her into the first turn, and she discovered that he danced with the same controlled grace he brought to everything else, leading her effortlessly across the floor while rain lashed the windows, and every eye in the ballroom tracked their progress with shock and avid curiosity. "You are trembling," he observed quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, and Eleanor could not tell if it was concern or amusement in his tone, though his hold on her tightened fractionally as though to steady her. "I am terrified," she admitted before she could stop herself, because the nearness of him had stripped away her careful defenses, and she found she could not lie to this man who looked at her as though she mattered. "I am terrified that tomorrow I will discover this was mockery or sport, and I am not certain I can survive being made a fool of again." His expression shifted into something fierce and protective, and he maneuvered them through a turn that brought them temporarily away from the nearest observers, his hand warm and solid against her back. "I give you my word, Miss Ashworth, that I have never been less inclined toward mockery in my entire life, and any man who made a fool of you was the fool himself for failing to recognize your worth." The words landed in her chest like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of impossible hope through her carefully constructed resignation, and she stared up at him with eyes that burned with unshed tears, because no one had spoken to her with such conviction in 7 years, not since the scandal that had transformed her from promising young woman into cautionary tale. "Tell me about your poetry," he said, as they moved together through the pattern of the waltz, their bodies aligned in a way that felt almost indecent despite the proper distance he maintained. "I want to know what words captured your attention so completely that you chose them over this gathering of peacocks." Eleanor felt something crack open inside her chest at his genuine interest, and before she could think better of it, she found herself confessing about the pseudonym she had used, the scandalous verses that had destroyed her engagement, the way writing had been both her salvation and her ruin, and Alexander Ravenscroft listened with an attention that felt like being seen for the first time in her life. His dark eyes never leaving her face as rain drummed against glass, and the other dancers blurred into insignificance around them. And when the music finally ended, and he bowed over her hand with a formality that transformed into intimacy. When his thumb brushed across her knuckles, he said in a voice rough with something she dared not name, "You are the most fascinating woman I have ever encountered, Miss Ashworth, and I find myself quite determined to know everything about you." Eleanor woke to grey morning light filtering through rain-streaked windows and the immediate crushing weight of consequence, her body exhausted from a sleepless night spent alternating between reliving every moment of Alexander Ravenscroft's arms around her and imagining the social devastation that must surely follow, because dukes did not dance with ruined spinsters without purpose, and she could not fathom what his purpose might be, except perhaps cruel amusement or a wager among his set, though his eyes had seemed so sincere and his touch so careful that her traitorous heart kept insisting it had been real, even as her mind catalogued all the ways she had made everything infinitely worse for herself. Martha Wentworth appeared at 10 o'clock with tea and the expression of grim concern that Eleanor had come to recognize over their 5 years together, the older woman's lined face softening with sympathy as she set the tray down and drew back the curtains, despite Eleanor's protest, letting in the pale light of a morning that matched Eleanor's mood with its persistent drizzle and low clouds. "Something happened last night," Martha said quietly. And it was not a question, but rather an invitation, and Eleanor found herself confessing everything while her tea grew cold, the words tumbling out about the dance and his questions, and the way he had looked at her as though she mattered. And Martha listened with the patience of someone who had witnessed 7 years of quiet suffering, and knew exactly how fragile hope could be in the heart of a woman society had deemed worthless. The knock at the door came at 10:30, and Eleanor's younger brother Thomas appeared with 3 folded notes in his hand and fury in his eyes, his 24 years evident in the protective rage that made him seem suddenly older as he dropped the papers on her bed and said with barely controlled anger that the vultures had wasted no time circling. Eleanor's hands shook as she opened the first note. Written in Caroline Sinclair's familiar hand, the words dripping with false concern as they asked what game Eleanor thought she was playing in attempting to ensnare the Duke of Thornbridge, suggesting that perhaps her years of obscurity had driven her to desperate measures that would only result in further humiliation when His Grace inevitably recognized his error in paying her the slightest attention. The second note came from Lady Pembroke herself, couched in the language of social obligation, but carrying the unmistakable message that Eleanor's performance last evening had been noted and would not be forgotten, with the clear implication that any attempts to rise above her station would be met with the full force of society's censure. The third note contained only 4 words in an unfamiliar hand, but they cut deeper than all the others combined because of their casual cruelty, and Eleanor stared at them until they blurred through her tears as Martha wrapped protective arms around her shoulders and Thomas swore with a vehemence that would have shocked their late mother, those 4 words branding themselves into her consciousness like a verdict she could not escape. How very pathetically desperate, and she knew with sickening certainty that by tonight all of London would be laughing at the ruined spinster who had dared to believe that a dance with a duke might mean something more than temporary charity. Eleanor was still sitting in numb silence with Thomas pacing furiously, and Martha holding her hand when the butler appeared in the doorway at 2 o'clock that afternoon with an expression of profound confusion, and announced that His Grace the Duke of Thornbridge had called and was requesting the honour of being received, and the words seemed to echo in the small room like a thunderclap that froze all three of them in attitudes of shock, because dukes did not call on ruined spinsters the day after dancing with them. Dukes did not follow mockery with formal visits during proper calling hours, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to pound with a terror that was somehow more frightening than resignation, because she did not know if she could survive having hope dangled before her, only to be snatched away again. Thomas moved first, his protective instincts overriding his surprise as he straightened his waistcoat and said he would receive his grace. But Eleanor found herself standing on shaking legs and smoothing down her simple mourning dress with trembling hands, because she needed to face this herself, needed to hear whatever cruel explanation or careless dismissal Alexander Ravenscroft had come to deliver, so she could finally stop the terrible hoping that had taken root in her chest, despite all her efforts to crush it. Alexander entered the modest drawing-room, carrying white roses, and the sight of him in the clear afternoon light streaming through windows where rain had finally ceased was almost painful in its impact. His dark hair slightly disheveled from the wind, and his eyes finding hers immediately with an intensity that made her breath catch, even as her mind insisted this could not mean what her heart desperately wished it might mean. "Miss Ashworth," he said with a formality that seemed deliberate, his voice carrying none of the mockery she had steeled herself to hear. "I apologize for calling without prior arrangement, but I found I could not wait another day to make my intentions clear to you and to your brother." Eleanor stared at him in confusion, while Thomas moved protectively to her side, and Martha gripped her hand hard enough to hurt, and Alexander set the white roses on the small table with careful precision, before turning to face them all with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined in a way that seemed impossible on the face of London's most dangerous duke. "I came because I wanted to," he said simply, looking directly at Eleanor with eyes that seemed to see straight through all her defenses into the terrified hoping underneath. "I came because our dance last night was the most genuine conversation I have had in a decade of empty social performances, because your honesty and intelligence and quiet dignity are worth more than all the calculated charms of every eligible woman in London, and because I would very much like your permission to call on you again." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that expanded outward until Eleanor felt they might drown her, and she was aware of Thomas's sharp intake of breath and Martha's fierce grip, and the way sunlight caught in Alexander's dark hair and made him seem almost unreal, standing in their modest drawing-room with white roses on the table and a request in his eyes that looked remarkably like hope. "Your Grace," Thomas began, his voice tight with protective suspicion, "my sister has endured enough cruel amusement at the hands of society, and if this is some manner of sport or wager, I must ask you to leave immediately." Alexander's expression shifted into something fierce and almost angry, but the anger seemed directed outward rather than at them, as he said with quiet conviction that carried the weight of absolute truth. "I give you my word as a gentleman, and on my family's honor, that I have never been more serious about anything in my life, and the only sport I intend is the systematic destruction of anyone who dares speak ill of your sister in my hearing." Eleanor felt tears burning in her eyes because his words were either the cruelest lie ever spoken or the answer to prayers she had stopped praying 7 years ago, and when Alexander turned to her and asked with remarkable gentleness if he might have permission to court her properly, she found herself nodding even as tears spilled down her cheeks and the terrible dangerous hope in her chest unfurled like flowers opening to unexpected sun. Alexander arrived at precisely 2 o'clock on October the 17th with more white roses and a determination in his eyes that made Eleanor's carefully constructed defenses tremble, and so began a week that would later shimmer in her memory like something from a dream she had not dared to have, each day bringing his steady presence into her life until the impossible began to feel almost real. He came every afternoon at the same hour with the reliability of the church bells that marked the passing time, and they walked in Hyde Park, while autumn leaves fell around them in shades of gold and crimson, their conversations ranging from poetry to philosophy to the small observations about life that revealed more about a person's character than any formal social performance ever could. And Eleanor found herself laughing for the first time in 7 years, the sound startling her own ears with its unfamiliarity. On the 3rd day, he brought her a gift that made her hands shake as she unwrapped it. A first-edition poetry collection so rare that she had only ever read about it in catalogues, and when she looked up at him with tears threatening, he said quietly that he had noticed the way her eyes lit when she spoke of poetry. And he wanted to see that light as often as possible, wanted to give her back the joy that society had tried so hard to steal from her. They sat together in the Ashworth drawing room that had become their sanctuary, while Martha discreetly occupied herself with needlework in the corner, and Thomas read his newspaper with the studied nonchalance of a protective brother who was slowly learning to trust. And Alexander asked Eleanor to read to him from her own poetry. The pages she had hidden for years after her scandal made her pseudonym worthless and her words feel like shameful secrets. She refused at first, the old fear rising sharp and choking in her throat, but he waited with patient understanding, and on the 5th day she finally retrieved the worn notebook from her room and read him a poem she had written about loneliness, her voice trembling and her eyes fixed on the pages because she could not bear to see his reaction. And when she finished, there was a silence that seemed to stretch for eternity before he said with rough emotion that her words were beautiful and true, and anyone who had made her feel otherwise was a fool who deserved neither her poetry nor her presence. Eleanor cried then, not the bitter tears of humiliation she had shed so many times before, but rather the healing tears of someone who had been seen and valued after years of invisibility. And Alexander moved closer on the sofa and took her hand with a gentleness that contradicted everything society said about his dangerous reputation, his thumb tracing circles on her palm while she composed herself and Martha pretended not to notice, and something profound settled between them like a promise not yet spoken aloud. Society began to take notice as the week progressed, the daily visits impossible to hide, and the Duke's intentions clear to anyone with eyes to see. And Eleanor found herself the object of speculative glances rather than pitying dismissal when she attended Lady Westbrook's gathering on the 7th day, wearing a new blue dress that Martha had insisted brought out her eyes, and though Caroline Sinclair watched from across the room with barely concealed malice, and Lady Pembroke's smile remained frozen and false, there were others who nodded with cautious respect, and Eleanor began to believe that perhaps her story was not yet finished after all. Eleanor arrived at Lady Westbrook's morning gathering on October 24th wearing the new blue dress that Alexander had said brought out her eyes, and for the first time in 7 years she felt something dangerously close to happiness as she entered the drawing-room, where morning sunlight streamed through tall windows and illuminated the gathered society women who turned to look at her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to calculation, and she was searching for Martha's familiar face among them when Caroline Sinclair stepped directly into her path with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, and said in a voice pitched to carry across the suddenly silent room that it was quite remarkable how some women would go to any lengths to trap a husband, even when society had long since deemed them unmarriageable. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and freezing her in place, while the happiness of moments before shattered into razor-sharp fragments that cut deep into the soft, vulnerable places she had been foolish enough to expose. And Caroline continued with malicious precision that everyone knew Miss Ashworth had written scandalous poetry that ruined her prospects 7 years ago, and now here she was using those same shameful talents to ensnare poor naive His Grace, who clearly did not understand the sort of woman he was dealing with, the sort who would use any manipulation necessary to secure a title and fortune she had no right to expect. Eleanor felt the familiar cold shame washing over her like a wave that threatened to pull her under, the old wounds tearing open with such practiced ease that she wondered how she had ever been foolish enough to believe they might have healed. And she was aware of the other women watching with avid interest, and Lady Pembroke's satisfied smile, and Martha pushing through the crowd toward her, and the way her hands were shaking so badly that she had to clasp them together to hide their trembling, while Caroline pressed her advantage with cruel enthusiasm. "You think we do not see what you are doing?" Caroline said with false sympathy that dripped poison, playing the tragic figure to win his pity, pretending your ruined reputation and scandalous past make you somehow intriguing rather than simply inappropriate. But the Duke will realize soon enough what a mistake he has made in paying attention to a woman who should have had the decency to retire from society entirely years ago, instead of lingering on the edges waiting for an opportunity to trap some unsuspecting gentleman. The tears came without permission, hot and humiliating, streaming down Eleanor's face while she stood frozen in the center of Lady Westbrook's drawing room, with the wreckage of her brief happiness scattered at her feet and the familiar weight of shame settling back onto her shoulders like an old familiar cloak. She had been foolish to think she might finally shed, and she was turning to flee when she heard Martha's sharp intake of breath and saw every face in the room suddenly looking past her toward the doorway, where Alexander Ravenscroft stood, with an expression of such cold fury that the temperature in the sun-filled room seemed to drop 20 degrees, and Caroline's triumphant smile froze into something resembling terror. Alexander's voice cut through the drawing room like a blade forged in Arctic ice, each word precise and laced with the sort of cold fury that had built his dangerous reputation across London's ballrooms and Parliament's halls, and he said Miss Sinclair with such cutting formality that Caroline visibly flinched, while every other woman in the room seemed to stop breathing entirely. "I was not aware that you had appointed yourself the arbiter of who deserves my attention or my regard, nor do I recall requesting your opinion on matters that are frankly none of your concern." He moved into the room with predatory grace, while Eleanor stood frozen with tears still streaming down her face, and Martha positioned herself protectively at her side, and the Duke's dark eyes never left Caroline's increasingly pale face as he continued in that same terrifyingly calm tone that was somehow more frightening than any shout could have been, cataloguing with brutal precision exactly how Caroline's own past was far from spotless, given her pursuit of 3 different titled gentlemen before settling for Mr. Sinclair when her dowry proved insufficient to secure anyone better, and how her current financial situation was rather precarious, given her husband's gambling debts that were only manageable because of business arrangements with families like the Ravenscrofts, who could withdraw their support at any moment. Caroline's smugness had evaporated into something resembling terror as she realized she had miscalculated catastrophically, and Lady Pembroke's satisfied smile had frozen into horrified understanding that she had aligned herself with the wrong side of this confrontation, while Alexander turned his attention briefly to Eleanor with an expression that gentled into protective tenderness before he looked back at Caroline and said in a voice that promised absolute destruction that if she ever spoke Miss Ashworth's name again in any context other than respectful admiration, he would personally ensure that her husband's debts were called in immediately, and the Sinclair family found themselves cut off from every line of credit and social invitation in London. The threat hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall, and Caroline had gone from pale to grey as the full weight of what she had done crashed down upon her. And Alexander continued with relentless precision that Miss Ashworth possessed more intelligence, grace, and genuine character in her smallest finger than Caroline had managed to cultivate in her entire being, and that her poetry, which Caroline had referred to as scandalous, was in fact remarkable and insightful, and he considered himself privileged to have read it, and anyone who suggested otherwise revealed only their own lack of refinement and understanding. Eleanor was staring at him with an expression caught between shock and something that looked dangerously like awe, while Martha nodded firm approval and Lady Westbrook watched with wide eyes from her position near the tea service, and Alexander finished his systematic destruction of Caroline by noting loudly enough for every witness to hear clearly that he was courting Miss Ashworth with the full intention of making her his Duchess, and anyone who had a problem with his choice was welcome to remove themselves from his acquaintance permanently, as he had no patience for small minds and smaller hearts. Caroline fled the room with tears of humiliation replacing her earlier malice, and Alexander finally turned his full attention to Eleanor and crossed the remaining distance between them and said softly, "Are you all right?" while the other women pretended not to watch, and Martha discreetly moved aside, and Eleanor found she could not speak around the tightness in her throat, but managed to nod, while he produced a handkerchief and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with a tenderness that contradicted everything about the cold fury he had just displayed. Alexander brought Eleanor home in his carriage at 4 in the afternoon of October 24th, and when Thomas opened the door and saw Eleanor's tear-stained face and the Duke's protective stance beside her, he stepped aside without question and allowed Alexander into their modest drawing-room where late afternoon golden light streamed through windows that overlooked the small garden already touched by autumn's chill, and Martha appeared long enough to bring tea with hands that trembled slightly with emotion before she quietly withdrew and pulled Thomas with her, leaving Eleanor and Alexander alone in a silence that felt thick with everything unspoken between them. Eleanor sat on the settee near the fire that Martha had lit against the cooling day, and Alexander took the chair across from her rather than sitting beside her. And she understood he was giving her space, even though every line of his body suggested he wanted to gather her close and protect her from every cruel word the world might ever speak. And the understanding of that restraint made something crack open in her chest, where she had been holding all her careful defenses. "I am sorry you had to witness that," she said finally, her voice still rough from crying. "And I am sorry Caroline involved you in my scandal, and I understand if you wish to distance yourself from me, now that you have seen how society truly views me, and how association with me will only bring you difficulty." Alexander leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and his dark eyes fixed on her face, with an intensity that made her breath catch. And he said, Eleanor, and the use of her given name without permission, sent warmth flooding through her. "Do you truly believe I defended you today because of some passing fancy or sense of duty that I might now abandon when faced with inconvenience?" She could not answer because her throat had closed around words she was afraid to speak, and he continued in that same low voice that seemed to resonate in her bones. "I noticed you at Lady Pembroke's ball because I recognized something in your eyes that I have seen in my own mirror for years, a loneliness that comes from being seen only as society defines you rather than as you truly are. And I approached you because I wanted to know the woman behind that careful dignity you wear like armor against a world that has judged you unfairly." The tears came again, but these felt different than the humiliated ones from earlier. These felt like something breaking open rather than breaking apart. And Alexander moved from his chair to sit beside her on the settee and took her hand in both of his with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his dangerous reputation, and his thumbs traced circles on her palm while he told her that he had been lonely in ways that had nothing to do with being alone, surrounded by people who wanted his tittle or his wealth or his influence, but never simply him. "I have spent 35 years being the dangerous Duke of Thornbridge," he said quietly, "the man mothers warn their daughters about, and fathers court for advantageous marriages. and I grew tired of the performance and the emptiness of it all. And then I saw you watching the ballroom with intelligence and compassion in your eyes, while society dismissed you as inconsequential. And I thought perhaps here is someone who might understand what it is to be unsint. Eleanor found her voice finally, and said, I was afraid to hope that your attention was real, afraid that hoping would make the inevitable disappointment unbearable when you realized I am exactly what society says I am. A ruined woman with a scandalous past who will bring you nothing but difficulty. Alexander lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that sent heat racing up her arm, and he said, You bring me the possibility of being seen and known and valued for something other than my title, and that is worth more than all the social approval in London. And Eleanor felt the last of her walls crumbling as she leaned forward until their foreheads touched, and whispered, I think I am falling in love with you. And his breath caught, and he said with fierce tenderness, Good, because I am already halfway lost in Alexander arrived at the Ashworth townhouse at precisely 3 in the afternoon on October 25th, with a nervousness he had not felt in more than a decade, thrumming through his veins like something alive and unpredictable. And when Thomas admitted him to the drawing-room, where afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows in golden bands that illuminated Eleanor sitting near the fire, in a gown the color of spring leaves, he felt his carefully prepared words dissolve into something far more fundamental and true. Eleanor rose when he entered, and he could see she was barely breathing, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white, and he realized with a surge of tender protectiveness that she was terrified this might not be what she hoped, terrified that even after everything he had said and done, she might still be disappointed. And the knowledge that society had taught her to doubt her own worth so thoroughly made him want to destroy every person who had ever made her feel less than extraordinary. He crossed to her and took both her hands in his and felt them trembling. And he said, Eleanor, I had planned a very eloquent speech about duty and compatibility and advantageous arrangements, but I find I cannot lie to you even in service of romance, so I will tell you the plain truth instead. She was staring up at him with those intelligent eyes that had first captured his attention, and he continued in a voice that was rougher than he intended because emotion was making it difficult to maintain his usual controlled composure. I have spent 35 years building walls around myself and learning to trust no one, and in 10 days you have managed to dismantle every defense I thought was impenetrable, and I find I do not want to rebuild them because being known by you is worth the vulnerability of being seen. He watched a tear slip down her cheek and reached up to catch it with his thumb, while he said, I am not a comfortable man to love. I have a dangerous reputation that is at least partially earned, and a tendency toward ruthlessness that will not disappear simply because I have found someone worth being gentle for. But I swear to you that I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never doubt your worth or your place beside me. And if you will consent to be my wife, I will count myself the most fortunate man in England. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper when she said yes, and then louder, with joy, breaking through like sunlight through storm clouds. Yes, Alexander, I will marry you. And he pulled a ring from his pocket that had belonged to his grandmother, a sapphire the color of midnight surrounded by diamonds that caught the afternoon light and scattered it into rainbows. And he slid it onto her finger while saying, This ring has waited 40 years for a woman worthy of wearing it, and I am grateful it waited for you. She was crying openly now, but smiling through the tears, and she said, I love you with such fierce certainty that his breath caught, and he drew her into his arms and kissed her with all the loneliness and longing and hope that had been building between them since that first waltz, and the kiss tasted of salt from her tears and felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. And when they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers and said, I love you. Eleanor Ashworth, soon to be Ravenscroft, and I will make certain the entire world knows it." Thomas and Martha must have been hovering nearby because they appeared almost immediately when called, and Thomas shook Alexander's hand with tears in his own eyes, while Martha embraced Eleanor and whispered blessings, and somewhere in the distance church bells began to ring, as though the city itself was celebrating this unexpected joy. The announcement appeared in the London Times on the morning of October 26, 1817, stating that Alexander Ravenscroft, Duke of Thornbridge, was pleased to announce his engagement to Miss Eleanor Ashworth, and by noon the news had spread through fashionable London like wildfire through dry grass, sparking reactions that ranged from shocked disbelief to calculating reconsideration of a woman society had dismissed as ruined and irrelevant. Eleanor woke that morning to find Alexander already at her door despite the early hour, and he swept her into his arms in the modest entrance hall with such fierce joy that Martha had to clear her throat twice before they remembered propriety, and he insisted on taking Eleanor to breakfast at Gunther's, where he could parade his future duchess before the morning crowds, and make absolutely certain no one could mistake the seriousness of his intentions. The sapphire ring glittered on Eleanor's left hand as they walked through Berkeley Square with the late October air crisp and cold around them, and she caught sight of Lady Westbrook crossing the street to greet them with congratulations that seemed genuinely warm, and Eleanor realized with a shock that the woman who had hosted the gathering where Caroline attacked her was now treating her with respect that bordered on deference. Over the following 4 days, the transformation in how society received Eleanor accelerated with dizzying speed. Invitations that had stopped arriving years ago now flooded the Ashworth townhouse until Martha needed a separate table just to organize them all, and Alexander insisted on accompanying Eleanor to every social engagement so he could watch with satisfaction as women who had whispered cruel gossip now smiled and complimented her, and pretended they had always thought highly of Miss Ashworth. On October 28th, Alexander took Eleanor to Madame Bellevaux's exclusive modiste shop on Bond Street, where he had made an appointment for her trousseau, and he sat in the private fitting room with masculine patience while Madame brought out silks and satins and laces in every colour imaginable, and when Eleanor protested that she could not possibly need so many gowns, Alexander said with that dangerous smile that made her heart race that his duchess would be dressed in a manner befitting her position, and he would tolerate no arguments on the matter. Eleanor stood on the fitting platform in a gown of deep emerald silk that made her eyes luminous, while Madame pinned the hem. And she caught Alexander's gaze in the mirror and saw such naked desire and possessive pride in his expression that heat flooded through her, and Madame made a knowing sound and suggested perhaps His Grace might wait in the outer salon. But Alexander simply said he was perfectly comfortable where he was, and continued watching Eleanor with an intensity that made her fingers tremble as she touched the fine fabric. The wedding dress Madame showed them on October 29th was ivory silk with intricate lace at the sleeves and neckline, elegant in its simplicity rather than ostentatious. And when Eleanor emerged from the dressing room wearing it, Alexander stood so abruptly his chair fell backward, and he crossed to her with his dark eyes blazing and said in a voice rough with emotion that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he could not wait to make her his wife in truth. Lady Beatrice Pembroke arrived at the Ashworth townhouse on the morning of November the 2nd, 1817, at precisely 11 o'clock, and the rigid set of her shoulders and the tightness around her mouth made it clear she had not come of her own volition, but under a compulsion that galled her deeply, and Eleanor, who was receiving morning callers in the drawing-room with Martha seated nearby as witness and companion, felt Alexander's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on her shoulder, where he stood behind her chair in a posture of protective possession that declared without words exactly who held the power in this encounter. Lady Pembroke's eyes flickered to Alexander, and then away quickly, as though the sight of his cold satisfaction pained her, and she said in a voice that trembled slightly with suppressed humiliation that she had come to offer her sincere apologies to Miss Ashworth for any lack of warmth or welcome she might have shown in the past, and Eleanor recognized the careful wording that had likely been rehearsed multiple times and suspected that Alexander had made it abundantly clear to Lord Pembroke that the family's extensive business interests with Ravenscroft Holdings depended entirely on this moment of contrition. The silence stretched for several heartbeats while Eleanor considered her response, and she felt within herself the warring impulses of the woman she had been who would have accepted any crumb of kindness with desperate gratitude, and the woman she was becoming who understood that she owed nothing to those who had been cruel when she was powerless. And it was Alexander's thumb brushing gently against her shoulder that reminded her she could choose grace not from weakness but from strength. Eleanor rose from her chair with the sapphire engagement ring catching the morning light and said in a voice that was steady and clear that she appreciated Lady Pembroke's visit and bore no lingering resentment for past slights. And she saw the flash of surprise in the older woman's eyes at being granted forgiveness so readily when they both knew Eleanor could have exacted a more painful revenge. Lady Pembroke's relief was visible as she expressed her hope that Miss Ashworth and the Duke would attend her winter ball in December, and Eleanor glanced up at Alexander, who gave her the smallest nod of permission to decide for herself. And she said they would be delighted to attend. And in that moment she felt the completion of a transformation that had begun in this very house when she had been powerless and afraid, and had now culminated in her showing mercy to a woman who had once held the power to wound her. As Lady Pembroke departed with effusive thanks that barely masked her mortification, the sound of other callers arriving in the entrance hall carried into the drawing-room, and Eleanor knew that multiple witnesses would observe Lady Pembroke leaving the Ashworth residence and would draw their own conclusions about what had transpired. And Alexander moved around her chair to take both her hands in his and said with fierce pride, blazing in his dark eyes, that she was magnificent and gracious and everything a duchess should be. And Eleanor felt the last lingering shadow of her old shame dissolve in the warmth of his regard. The 12 days between November 3rd and November 15th, 1817, passed in a flurry of wedding preparations that transformed the modest Ashworth townhouse into a headquarters of joyful activity. And Eleanor found herself surrounded by fabrics and flowers and guest lists and menu selections, while Alexander visited every afternoon at 2 o'clock, as had become their cherished ritual. Though now, as her acknowledged fiancé, he was granted the privilege of time alone with her in the drawing-room without Martha hovering quite so closely, and these stolen hours of relative privacy became Eleanor's most treasured moments as they sat together on the settee, with his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest, while they discussed their future with an intimacy that made her heart race and her cheeks flush with anticipation. On November 3rd, Alexander took Eleanor to see Ravenscroft Park, his primary estate located 3 hours north of London in Hertfordshire, and as their carriage rolled up the long drive lined with ancient oaks, just beginning to lose their autumn leaves, Eleanor caught her first glimpse of the magnificent Palladian manor house, with its honey-coloured stone glowing in the pale November sunlight. And Alexander watched her face with an intensity that spoke of his need for her approval, and when she breathed that it was the most beautiful place she had ever seen, he pulled her close and whispered against her hair that it would truly become beautiful only when she was its mistress and filled its rooms with her warmth and laughter. The housekeeper Mrs. Davies and the butler Stevens greeted Eleanor with respectful deference that held genuine warmth beneath the formality, and as Alexander showed her through the grand rooms with their tall windows and elegant furnishings, he pointed out the private sitting room adjacent to the Duchess's chambers that he had already instructed be converted into a writing room for her poetry, complete with a desk positioned to catch the morning light and shelves waiting to be filled with her books. And Eleanor stopped in the doorway of that sun-filled space and felt tears slip down her cheeks because no one in her entire life had ever made such a gesture of understanding what truly mattered to her soul. The wedding itself was planned for December 7th, 1817, at St. George's Church in Hanover Square, with a breakfast to follow at Ravenscroft House in Mayfair, and the guest list had swelled to over 200 people, as every family of consequence angled for an invitation to what had become the most anticipated social event of the winter season. And Eleanor felt a sharp satisfaction in knowing that many who had whispered cruel gossip about her would now witness her triumph as she became the Duchess of Thornbridge. On November 10th, Madame Beliveau delivered the finished wedding dress for a final fitting, and when Eleanor stood before the mirror in the ivory silk gown with its delicate lace and pearl buttons running down the back, Martha wept openly and said that she looked like an angel, and Alexander, who arrived early and convinced Martha to let him see despite the superstition about grooms viewing the dress before the wedding, stood frozen in the doorway with such blazing love in his dark eyes that Eleanor understood with absolute certainty that she was cherished beyond measure. The final 2 weeks before the wedding passed in a haze of fittings and menu selections and seating arrangements, but what Eleanor would remember most vividly in years to come were the quiet moments stolen between the chaos when Alexander would arrive at the townhouse and pull her into his arms the moment they were alone, and hold her as though she were something infinitely precious. And on November 18th, he brought her to his study at Ravenscroft House, and showed her the volumes of poetry he had been collecting for her personal library, first editions and rare manuscripts that must have cost a small fortune. And when she protested that it was too much, he had silenced her with a kiss that left her breathless and trembling, and said that nothing would ever be too much for her, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life proving that she deserved every beautiful thing the world could offer. On November 20th, they attended the theatre together in full view of society, and Eleanor sat in the Ravenscroft box, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that Alexander had commissioned specifically, because he said it made her eyes luminous, and she felt the weight of hundreds of gazes upon them. But instead of the old shame, she felt only pride, because Alexander kept her hand clasped in his throughout the performance and whispered in her ear during the intermission that he was the most envied man in London for having won her heart. Thomas observed his sister's transformation with satisfaction, and told Alexander privately on November 22nd that he had never seen Eleanor so happy, and that he was grateful beyond words that someone finally recognized her worth. And Alexander had gripped the younger man's shoulder and said that he was the fortunate one, because Eleanor had taught him that true nobility lay not in titles or wealth, but in the courage to remain kind and generous even when the world had been cruel. And Thomas understood in that moment why his sister loved this man who had such a fearsome reputation, but who looked at Eleanor as though she hung the moon and stars. On November 25th, Alexander took Eleanor to the small family chapel at Ravenscroft Park, where they would speak their private vows before God on the morning of the wedding, before the larger public ceremony, and he showed her the names carved into the stone walls of generations of Ravenscrofts who had married for love despite social pressure to make advantageous matches. And he told her that she would add her name to that wall as his Duchess, and that their children would know the story of how their father had fallen in love with the most remarkable woman in England who society had foolishly overlooked. The nights grew longer and colder as December approached, but Eleanor had never felt warmer or more alive as she lay in her bed at the Ashworth townhouse, counting the days until December 7th, when she would walk down the aisle of St. George's and bind her life to Alexander's forever. And Martha would find her sometimes standing at the window with the sapphire engagement ring catching the lamplight, and a smile of such perfect contentment on her face that the older woman would offer a silent prayer of thanksgiving that her dear girl had finally found the love she had always deserved. The days between November 28th and December 6th, 1817, passed with an agonizing slowness for Eleanor, despite the constant whirlwind of activity as final preparations consumed every waking hour, and she found herself caught between desperate impatience to become Alexander's wife and a strange melancholy at leaving behind the quiet life she had known for so long in the modest Ashworth townhouse, though Martha assured her it was perfectly natural for a bride to feel such conflicting emotions in the final week before her wedding. On November 30th, Alexander arrived at the townhouse with a velvet box containing a gift he insisted she open immediately, despite her protests that he had already given her far too much, and when she lifted the lid, she found a delicate gold necklace with a pendant in the shape of a quill pen set with tiny diamonds that caught the afternoon light like captured stars, and he fastened it around her throat with fingers that trembled slightly, and told her that he wanted her to wear it on their wedding day as a symbol of his love for every part of her, including the poet whose words had first revealed to him the depth of her soul. Thomas spent December 1st reviewing the marriage settlements with Alexander's solicitors and reported to Eleanor that evening that the Duke had settled upon her an independence that would make her one of the wealthiest women in England in her own right, with funds that could never be touched by anyone, including Alexander himself. And when she had confronted her betrothed about such extravagant generosity, he had simply said that he wanted her to know she was choosing him freely and not out of financial necessity or social pressure, and Eleanor had kissed him with such fierce gratitude that he had groaned and pulled away before propriety could be entirely abandoned in the Ashworth drawing-room. On December 3rd, Eleanor made a final visit to the modiste to collect her travelling costume for the honeymoon journey, and found that Alexander had secretly commissioned an entire additional wardrobe to be delivered to Ravenscroft Park as a surprise, and Madame Bellevaux showed her sketches of morning dresses and evening gowns and riding habits in rich fabrics and jewel tones that made Eleanor's carefully budgeted trousseau look almost shabby by comparison, though the Frenchwoman assured her that the Duke had specifically requested styles that would suit Eleanor's particular colouring and elegant simplicity rather than the fussy over-ornamentation currently fashionable among younger women. The nights grew shorter as winter deepened, and Eleanor lay awake in her narrow bed at the townhouse, counting the hours until December 7th, when she would walk down the aisle of St. George's and speak the vows that would bind her to Alexander forever. And she thought about the girl she had been at 21 when her first engagement had ended in such public humiliation, and how that younger Eleanor could never have imagined that 7 years later she would be preparing to marry a duke who loved her not despite her scandal, but because he saw past society's judgment to the woman underneath. And she offered a silent prayer of gratitude for every hardship and every lonely year, because they had shaped her into someone capable of recognizing and cherishing the extraordinary gift of Alexander's love. The morning of December 6th, 1817, dawned cold and clear with frost etching delicate patterns on the windows of Eleanor's bedroom at the Ashworth townhouse, and she woke with her heart pounding in a mixture of anticipation and something that felt almost like terror, because tomorrow, at this time, she would be Alexander's wife and the Duchess of Thornbridge, and despite all the weeks of preparation, some part of her still could not quite believe that this extraordinary transformation was truly happening to Eleanor Ashworth, who had been society's invisible spinster barely 2 months ago. Martha found her standing at the window wrapped in a shawl, watching the winter sun rise over London's rooftops, and the older woman came to stand beside her, and asked gently if she was having second thoughts. But Eleanor had turned with eyes that shone with unshed tears, and said no. She was simply trying to memorize this moment of being the old Eleanor one last time before she stepped into a future more beautiful than anything she had ever dared to dream possible. At 10 a.m. Alexander arrived despite the impropriety of calling so early, because he said he could not bear to spend their last day as unmarried people apart, and Thomas had laughed and surrendered the drawing-room to them with only Martha as chaperone, and Alexander had pulled Eleanor into his arms the moment they were as alone as propriety allowed, and kissed her with a hunger that made her knees weak and her heart race until Martha cleared her throat pointedly, and they broke apart flushed and breathless and grinning like children caught stealing sweets. They spent the morning going over final details for the ceremony that would take place at George's at 11 a.m. the following day, with the private vows in the Ravenscroft chapel beforehand at 9 a.m. for only the closest family. And Alexander told her again that he had arranged for her poetry collection to be published under her own name as a wedding gift, with a first edition bound in white leather waiting for her at Ravenscroft Park. And Eleanor had wept, and told him that he had given her back, not just her future, but the parts of herself she had thought lost forever when society had deemed her ruined and worthless. At noon they shared a quiet luncheon with Thomas and Martha, and the conversation turned to memories of Eleanor's childhood and the early days after their father's death, when money had been tight and prospects uncertain. And Alexander listened with fierce attention to every story, as though memorizing the details of the life she had lived before him. And Eleanor understood that he wanted to know every version of her that had existed because he loved not just who she was now, but the journey that had shaped her. In the afternoon, Alexander took her driving through Hyde Park one final time as Miss Ashworth, and the winter sun slanted through the bare branches of the trees and caught the sapphire on her left hand, sending blue fire dancing across the interior of the carriage, and he told her that he had never believed in fate or providence until the night he had walked into Lady Pembroke's ballroom and seen a woman in grey standing alone by the windows, and felt his entire future shift and realign around that single moment. When he returned her to the townhouse at 4 p.m., he held her hands for a long moment on the front steps and told her that the next time he saw her, she would be walking down the aisle toward him, and that he would spend every remaining day of his life being grateful that she had chosen to trust him with her heart, despite every reason society had given her to protect it. And Eleanor had whispered that he had taught her the difference between existing and living, and that she could not wait to begin their life together. The morning of December the 7th, 1817, arrived with a stillness that felt almost sacred. As Eleanor woke in the pale pre-dawn darkness of her childhood bedroom for the very last time, and she lay perfectly still beneath the familiar weight of quilts her mother had sewn years before, listening to the quiet sounds of the townhouse stirring to life around her, and thinking that in just 5 hours she would speak vows that would transform her from Miss Eleanor Ashworth into Her Grace the Duchess of Thornbridge, a title that still felt impossibly grand and unreal, despite all the weeks of preparation that had led to this extraordinary morning. Martha appeared at 6 a.m. with hot chocolate and tears already streaming down her lined face, and she helped Eleanor into the bathing room, where a copper tub had been filled with steaming water scented with lavender and rose petals, and as Eleanor sank into the fragrant warmth, she felt the last traces of tension dissolve from her shoulders, and thought about how 2 months ago she had been the invisible spinster standing alone at the edges of Lady Pembroke's ballroom, resigned to a life of quiet obscurity, and now she was preparing to marry a man who loved her with a fierce devotion that still took her breath away whenever she allowed herself to fully comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. At 7 a.m., Thomas knocked softly, and entered to find his sister wrapped in a dressing gown with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and he crossed the room to take both her hands in his and told her with a voice thick with emotion that their father would have been so proud to see her marry a man worthy of her intelligence and courage and kindness. And Eleanor had embraced him tightly and whispered that none of this would have been possible without his steadfast support during the 7 years when society had deemed her ruined and worthless, and they stood together in the quiet morning light, sharing a moment of profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this day. Martha and two maids began the elaborate process of dressing Eleanor at 7:30 m.m. First the delicate silk stockings and embroidered chemise, then the corset laced just tight enough to create an elegant silhouette beneath the wedding gown. And finally, the dress itself was lifted carefully over her head and settled into place with a whisper of ivory silk and Belgian lace. The bodice fitted perfectly to her slender frame, and the skirt falling in graceful folds that caught the morning light like captured moonbeams. And when Martha fastened the gold necklace with the diamond quill pendant around Eleanor's throat and arranged the simple wreath of white roses and winter greenery in her dark hair, Eleanor looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw not the plain, overlooked spinster society had dismissed, but a woman transformed by love into someone beautiful and worthy and chosen. At 8:30 a.m., Alexander's carriage arrived to transport Eleanor and Thomas to the Ravenscroft private chapel for the intimate family ceremony that would precede the public wedding at St. George's. And as Eleanor descended the stairs of the townhouse for the final time as Miss Ashworth, she carried a bouquet of white roses and ivy, and wore her mother's pearl earrings, and felt her heart beating so hard she thought it might burst through the silk bodice of her wedding gown. And Thomas handed her into the carriage with such tender care that she had to blink back tears because she knew he was remembering the devastated girl she had been 7 years ago when her first engagement had ended in scandal and humiliation. And she squeezed his hand and smiled to show him that she was not that broken girl anymore, but a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as disasters, and that true love is worth every moment of waiting and every tear shed in loneliness during the long years before it finally arrives. The Ravenscroft private chapel was a small jewel box of ancient stone and stained glass tucked into the grounds of the family's London estate. And when Eleanor's carriage pulled through the gates at 8:45 a.m., she saw Alexander standing on the chapel steps in the December morning light, wearing formal black attire with a burgundy waistcoat, and looking so handsome and nervous that her heart clenched with fierce love. And when Thomas handed her down from the carriage, Alexander crossed to them immediately, and took both her hands and told her she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and that he had not slept at all, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw her walking toward him in this exact moment. Inside the chapel waited only Thomas and Martha, and Alexander's elderly aunt Catherine, who had travelled from Scotland to serve as witness, and the space was filled with winter sunlight streaming through windows that depicted scenes from the Song of Solomon. And when the family chaplain asked them to join hands, Eleanor felt Alexander's fingers trembling against hers, and understood that this intensely powerful man, who had destroyed her enemies and defied society for her, was as overwhelmed by the magnitude of this moment as she was. The private vows they spoke were the ones they had written themselves in late-night conversations over the past weeks, and Alexander promised to honor her mind as well as her heart, to protect her courage while never limiting her spirit, to be her champion and her partner and her devoted lover for all the days of their lives. And Eleanor promised to trust him with the parts of herself she had hidden from the world, to stand beside him as his duchess and his equal, to love him with the same fierce loyalty he had shown her from the moment he had crossed that ballroom to claim the woman no one else had seen. When the chaplain pronounced them married in the eyes of God, and Alexander slipped a second ring onto her finger beside the sapphire engagement band, this one a simple gold circlet engraved with words from her own poetry that he had memorized, Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks, and Alexander cupped her face in both hands and kissed her with such tender reverence that she heard Martha sob behind them, and felt the last fragments of the broken, frightened girl she had been for 7 years finally dissolve and transform into the woman she was always meant to become. They stayed in the chapel for 15 minutes after the ceremony, while Martha fussed with Eleanor's dress, and Thomas embraced his new brother with obvious emotion, and Alexander kept Eleanor's hand clasped in his, as though afraid she might disappear if he released her. And he whispered against her temple that she was his duchess now, his wife, his Eleanor, and that he would spend the rest of his life making certain she never doubted her worth or his devotion. At 9:30 a.m. they climbed back into the carriage for the short drive to St. George's, where 200 guests waited for the public ceremony that would formally announce to all of London society that the dangerous Duke of Thornbridge had married the woman they had dismissed as a ruined spinster. And as the carriage rolled through the winter morning streets, Eleanor looked down at the 2 rings on her left hand and thought about how completely her life had transformed in the 8 weeks since that October evening, when she had stood alone at the edges of Lady Pembroke's ballroom, resigned to invisibility. And she understood that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with a first meeting, but with a first moment of truly being seen. The public ceremony at St. George's began at 10 a.m. on December 7th, with every pew filled with London society's most influential families, and as Eleanor walked down the long aisle on Thomas's arm, with winter sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows to paint coloured shadows across the ancient stone floor, she saw the faces of people who had dismissed her and pitied her and gossiped about her for 7 years now, watching with expressions of wonder and recalculation. And she held her head high with the confidence of a woman who had learned her worth not from their approval, but from the love of a man who had chosen her when society deemed her ruined and worthless. Alexander stood waiting at the altar in his formal attire, with his grey eyes fixed on her with such fierce devotion that Eleanor felt her breath catch. And when Thomas placed her hand in Alexander's and stepped back to join Martha in the front pew, Alexander lifted her fingers to his lips and whispered that she was his miracle and his redemption, and that watching her walk toward him was the most beautiful moment of his entire life. The Archbishop conducted the public ceremony with appropriate solemnity, and when he asked if anyone present knew of any impediment to this union, Eleanor felt Alexander's hand tighten on hers as though daring anyone to speak. But the silence that followed was complete and respectful, and she understood that whatever doubts society had harbored about this marriage had been thoroughly conquered by Alexander's unwavering devotion and her own dignified grace over the past 8 weeks. They spoke the traditional vows this time with steady voices that carried through the hushed church, and when Alexander slipped the same gold band onto her finger that he had placed there in the private chapel 90 minutes earlier, and promised before God and 200 witnesses to love and honor her for all the days of his life, Eleanor felt the final weight of 7 years of shame and isolation lift from her shoulders and transform into wings that might carry her anywhere. The kiss Alexander gave her after the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife was briefer and more restrained than the one they had shared in the private chapel, but his eyes, when he pulled back, held promises of deeper intimacy to come, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm as he tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow and turned to lead her back down the aisle as the church bells began to peal overhead in joyous celebration. The receiving line afterward lasted nearly 2 hours as every guest filed past to offer congratulations, and Eleanor watched with quiet satisfaction as Lady Pembroke curtsied stiffly and addressed her as "Your Grace," as Caroline's mother apologized again for her daughter's unforgivable behavior without meeting Eleanor's eyes, as dozens of people who had ignored her for years now smiled and praised her beauty and wished her happiness. Alexander never left her side throughout the entire exhausting ritual, his hand at the small of her back or holding hers, his voice warm with pride whenever he introduced her as his duchess, his eyes constantly checking to ensure she was comfortable and happy, and Eleanor understood that this protective devotion would be the bedrock of their marriage for all the years to come.